A Tale at Midnight. Mannequins and Aspects of Terror by Mark Samuels. Your eyes did see my unformed substance. Psalm 139. The office tower had long fascinated me. I would gaze at it from the windows of Barlow and Barlow Associates, the architectural firm that employed me. Over the course of the last 4 years, I had watched the tower becoming gradually deserted. One company after another had left the premises, and once darkness fell, the number of windows that were lit up became gradually less. Businesses whose offices were located there seemed unable to achieve commercial success. From what I could gather, those working within its confines complained of a general malaise and a progressive worsening of staff morale over time. There were rumors about the air conditioning system carrying some form of Legionnaire's disease, but extensive tests showed no trace of its presence. In the end, the inconclusive reason given was that those working there were subject to sick building syndrome. The tower consisted of 27 floors with an exterior of dark green glass. Its appearance had worsened as the years passed, and it stood as an obvious indictment of 1960s architecture, a decaying monument to inhuman design that dominated the skyline for miles around. And then one night I realized that the last of the businesses in the building must have relocated. The single floor that had been lit during the hours of darkness now had windows as black as the rest. The building was untenanted and desolate. Nothing moved within its confines, and I imagined in my mind's eye the abandoned and silent spaces, the empty rooms, and the labyrinth of dusty corridors. In the teeming metropolis, whose streets and buildings were crawling with people, like insects in a hive, this tower was vacant, a void. The building had a profound effect upon my own work. The architectural designs upon which I was working for my firm gave me little satisfaction. My realized projects had consisted only of nondescript houses, public utilities, and the updating of an unremarkable bus depot in the north of the country. I longed for the opportunity to work on a larger, grander scale, on some construction that would be appreciated, that would be seen from far away, my own pinnacle amongst the office towers scattered across the city. In idle moments, I would sketch designs for the tower that I would build, and invariably its lines echoed the empty building that dominated the view from my drawing board. I wanted so badly to wander around inside the building, and I told myself that it was for the purposes of my pet architectural project. Yet perhaps it was really a fascination for solitude that drew me to it. Certainly I had been conscious of its appeal becoming stronger, as fewer and fewer windows had been left lit in the evenings. So completely abandoned, it seemed to me a consummation of a terrible beauty. For what was it now but a vacuum, an oasis of nothing, where all else around it was but the maddening whirl of asinine human activity? I viewed it as a vertical desert, closed off from the outside, a region without the distractions of the commonplace. I did wonder for a while whether it would be feasible to employ the designs for my own tower in a radical refurbishment of the existing building, but in the end, I resisted this idea. It was not just that my ego preferred the potential of an entirely new project. I also did not want to see the building changed. I was fascinated by the tower because of its very abandonment. Yet, if it was my ambition to be the designer of a similar tower with the same starkness of design, a construction looming high above the teeming streets and framed by the sky, one whose very presence caused men's views to be drawn upwards by its smooth lines and uncluttered simplicity, then it would make sense for me to see the original from the inside, to study it fully. A few days after the lights on that last occupied floor were extinguished, I attempted to gain entry. I finished at work and walked through the few streets that lay between my place of employment and the tower. It was a dark winter's afternoon, even though it wasn't late, and although I knew that my expedition was likely to end in failure, I needed to at least try to get into the building, if only for my own peace of mind. I finally stood at its base. The gigantic monolith seemed almost to blot out the sky. It was immediately obvious that I was not going to be able to get inside. The foyer had been boarded up and padlocked, and the first 2 floors were protected by corrugated iron sheets. Higher up, the windows were completely dark. For a brief moment, I fancied that I saw a pale white face at one of them, but quickly realized that it must have been a trick of the early evening light. The whole building was obviously deserted. For a time, I wandered aimlessly around its circumference and across the abandoned square in which it stood, with its concrete loggias and unused car park. In the end, I gave up and made my way home to my apartment on the other side of the city. Almost every night for weeks afterwards, I would dream of treading the lost corridors and empty offices of the tower, the canteens, stairways, storage rooms, and lavatories. During my lunch hours at work, I would make sketches of the tower, drawing its planes and angles, and noting its few stark details. My interest in it was the cause of some curiosity in my work colleagues, and several of them even asked to view the structure through the field glasses that I had bought in order to examine the building more closely. I felt some resentment at their interest. I had begun to regard the tower as my sole preserve. I alone could appreciate the splendid starkness of its design and the desolation that it contained. I had always been an outsider in the profession. I worked alongside qualified architects who were university trained, but I was a mere technician. The fact that I did a comparable job meant nothing in terms of status or pay. Nevertheless, I had risen through the firm's ranks and was now entrusted with overall control of some projects, although I was never given anything with any real scope for design. The moment I realized that the tower had become finally empty, I began to neglect my proper work. But because I was considered such a useful employee, it took quite some time before it was noticed that I was behind schedule and questions were asked. One afternoon, a colleague who knew of my interest in the tower passed me a newspaper containing an advertisement for an art installation. I did not see the significance at first, but he pointed out that it was housed on the uppermost floors of my tower. The installation was temporarily closed, but apparently due to reopen on the Friday of the following week. I had not been aware of its existence, although the installation by the artist Eliezer Golmi appeared to have been exhibited there for some undefined period. I recognized the name of the artist, of course, for he had also been the architect of the building that housed his installation. On several occasions, I had attempted to track the man down in order to express my interest in his designs, but he seemed no longer to work in the profession and had, effectively, gone underground after some unspecified crisis many years ago. The few that knew of him had told me that he had been disillusioned by attacks on his work from both inside and outside the profession. Other architects of the 1960s had been thick-skinned enough to ignore criticism, but not Golmi. The advertised details of the installation left me with mixed feelings. The show was entitled Mannequins and Aspects of Terror and promised, it was claimed, an audio-visual experience of an unsettling nature in which one would encounter a universe of fear. This didn't sound like the Golmi that I had imagined. Some saw horror, it was true, in what his buildings had been allowed to become, grimy, decaying concrete hulks. But I saw them as they were first built, tall, proud visions of a noble future, reaching up to the heavens with pure, dynamic lines, Golmi was not to blame if the owners of his buildings had refused to maintain them and let them crumble. But why was he interested in terror and unsettling people and exploring fear? I came up with many theories in the long days before I was able to see the installation for myself. It seemed probable that Golmi would be exploring the horror of what other people had done to his glorious work. I kept a close eye on the top floor of the building and hung around the padlocked doors for many hours in the hope of detecting the work that would, no doubt, be required for the reopening. But I saw nothing. At last the designated night came, and I found that the tower's foyer had indeed been reopened. The padlocks on the boards were gone, exposing the dark green windows on the ground floor. A single poster advertised the installation. It was rather gaudy, with a purple Gothic script on a yellow background. At its center was a grainy photograph of the architect and artist. At the time the photograph was taken, Golmi must have been in his 50s. He had brill-creamed gray hair, a high forehead, and dark eyes, one of which, the right, was considerably larger than the other. It gave the face an unfortunate, lopsided appearance. His expression reminded me of the rigidity common to those early photographs where the subject had to sit perfectly still for several minutes while the camera shutter was left open. I stood back and once again gazed up at Golmi's monolith. Was it possible to reconcile the utopian vision of his design, with its sharp lines soaring ever upwards, with the crumbling pile of dark-stained concrete and glass it had become? Both fascinated me. Perhaps the fact that Golmi had placed his art installation in one of his own buildings meant that he, too, had realized the spectral potential of the tower. Had he also come to relish this desolate space in the teeming metropolis? I entered the foyer and made my way to a single desk situated in the very center of the otherwise empty space. There was a simple sign declaring that the installation began on floor 26 and that payment was to be made at the end of the show. There was no attendant to direct the visitors, but next to the sign was a schedule of entry times. My watch told me that the next available slot began in 5 minutes. The last visitor had signed the register 5 minutes previously and marked the time clearly, as required in the box provided. A handwritten note at the top of the page stated that admittance was staggered to ensure the isolation necessary for each visitor. I faithfully signed the register, and when my time came, I made my way over to one of several lifts and pressed the button. A small sign informed me that this was the one to be used in order to visit the installation. I watched the numbers on the indicator above the single door flash from 26 downwards. While I waited, I looked at the remnants of company names printed on a wooden board. They must have been defaced by disgruntled employees as their companies gave up and vacated the building. When the lift arrived, I opened the outer door and then pulled across the trellis gate that separated me from the paneled wooden cage within. The interior was not large, having a capacity for a maximum of 4 people. At first, I simply thought it small for a building with such a potentially huge occupancy. It had obviously seen much use. I thought from its design that the lift must date to the 1950s. So perhaps the building was older than I thought. I was feeling a certain amount of confusion, perhaps due to my excitement at the prospect of the installation, but also because of the claustrophobia caused by being in such a small space and the reflection of myself in the full-length mirror on the back wall of the lift. Gazing into it, I was somewhat startled by my anxious-looking appearance. My eyes seemed to stare wildly from behind my glasses, and my cheeks were flushed. The business suit that I was obliged to wear to work seemed comically apt, as did the briefcase I carried. Since I had come directly from my office, I had not had the opportunity to change my clothes. The lift rumbled upwards through the shaft, and floor after floor flashed by before it reached the 26th. The cage jolted to a halt, and I pulled back the trellis door, opened the outer one, and entered a long, deserted corridor, dimly lit and utterly silent. The floor was covered in tiled linoleum, but it was well-worn and curled upwards at the edges. In patches, it had come away altogether, revealing stained concrete beneath. As I proceeded uncertainly, I could see holes in the false ceiling, where the covering polystyrene tiles had fallen down. Out of these holes trailed cables and wires. It was not obvious where I should be going, so I looked in through a half-open toilet to my left. It was an abandoned gents' toilet, thick with dirt. The cubicle doors hung ajar, and the toilet bowls and urinals were broken, with fragments of porcelain scattered on the floor. I returned to the corridor, and after a few more paces, finally noticed a sign with an arrow, indicating the direction I was to follow. I turned right. This corridor seemed to be exactly the same as the first. I was beginning to feel a sense of emptiness creep over me, deadening my spirits, replacing the tension I'd previously felt. And then I realized what should have been obvious. This was the installation. The sense of isolation and dislocation was complete. I felt utterly alone as I walked through the confines of the artificial void. The atmosphere of neglect and decay grew steadily, and I congratulated Golmi on his achievement. I wondered just when the idea for the installation had come to him. Perhaps he had received some dim intimation of the final destiny of his building when he was still a successful architect. It was a bold conceit to think of placing his personal nightmare in his own building as it had decayed and become uninhabitable. I even suspected him of vandalizing his own building as a means of amplifying the decay. And what might he be saying about architecture in general, or modern life, or the human condition? Again, I thought about the word on the advertisement, reopening. If the installation had been first opened while there were still occupants, then what had they thought of it? Did Golmi set up the installation when he knew that the last companies were moving out? Or had it hastened their exit? How far back had he considered this project? I thought of making my way out, but then I remembered the title of the piece and guessed that I might not have seen it all. I had become aware of a sound, coming as if from a great distance. It was like the white noise found on frequencies between television stations. I had read that this was the sound of the background radiation generated when the universe came into existence billions of years ago. The sound remained at the same level as I proceeded, and I could not detect its source, though I suspected that it must have been piped through concealed speakers. Looking through the windows to my left, I saw the vast panorama of the city below, its glittering sodium orange lights so very far removed from this study of desolation. Within was eternal twilight, grayness and shadow, an effect achieved by low-wattage strip lighting. There was a large office to my right. Inside, all of the furniture had been removed, and there were marks on the thin carpet where the desks, chairs, and filing cabinets must once have stood. The continuous hiss of background static was beginning to annoy me. Its familiarity had failed to make it subliminal. If I listened with enough concentration, it sounded almost like whispering, and although it was almost inaudible, I was becoming sure that it was charged with some hidden significance. In the next corridor was a sign, a ragged thing of cardboard, with letters scrawled as if in a child's handwriting. It read, "Mannequins and Aspects of Terror," so perhaps the real installation was about to begin. Almost at once, I came across the first of the mannequins. In the twilight of the corridor, and from a distance, I initially thought that it must be a custodian, there to oversee the exhibition and guide the visitors. This would certainly have been useful, for the arrows were few and far between. As I drew closer to the mannequin, I noticed that the background hiss had acquired a new element. There were definite words amongst the static, though broken and garbled, like speech distorted by poor radio reception. I could not make out the words, but the voice seemed to speak as if in pain, almost as if it were incoherent with that pain. I thought that one of the words might be alive, croaked out over and over again, but could not be sure. And then suddenly I was close enough to see the face of the mannequin. It had been made insidiously disturbing. It was rigid and frozen in stark panic, as if it were looking at some particularly horrific sight, and its arms were raised as if to ward off some approaching menace. As I stared at the thing, I felt contaminated by it, fearing that my own features were beginning to assume the dummy's own, and that my mind might give way to the fear that had frozen it. When I thought of that lifeless mouth actually forming the broken words that still mingled with the low background noise of static, I had to acknowledge that the artist had indeed managed to create the terror claimed by the advertisement. The noise began to fade as I walked nervously on down the dusty corridor. It was gradually replaced by another sound, like that of people muttering quietly to each other in some other part of the building. The mutterings were clearly audible, and I could not shake off the feeling that they were aware of my presence, even though the idea was absurd. I kept glancing behind me as I progressed, and found that I was almost creeping along, anticipating dangers that might lurk around the next corner. In my anxiety, I began to mumble to myself, and the sound of my own voice offered some meager comfort. The next port of call was an office that appeared, at first glance, to be still in use. I paused for a moment, taken in by the illusion, until I perceived that the figures therein were absolutely motionless. I could not find the courage to enter the room, and was gripped by the unsettling notion that they had stopped their activities at the very moment that I had first caught sight of them. The sounds of activity that I had heard with increasing clarity had also seemed to cease at that exact moment. A hidden motion sensor must have detected me and would have been programmed to turn off the tape recording of the voices. 4 mannequins occupied this office, 3 of which were hunched in front of blank computer screens. Their hands were at the keyboards as if they had been interrupted in the act of inputting data. The dummies were dressed in business suits that showed signs of old age and wear. The elbows and cuffs were frayed, and there were patches of ugly discoloration across the pinstriped fabric. These mannequins seemed to be smiling, but as I reluctantly entered the room for a closer look at them, I saw that they were not pleasant smiles. They had been crafted so as to resemble the rictus grin of the human skull. The sole standing mannequin had been given a similar expression, but its staring eyes seemed less glassy than the others. I thought they had moved. I left the room and walked, more swiftly now, along the corridor. The sounds of activity resumed behind me, furtively at first, but with increasing boldness as I moved further away. I could not help looking back, for I had developed a dread that the standing mannequin would start into spasmodic life and come after me. I had by this time reached a stairwell, and a painted arrow indicated that I was to ascend to the floor above. The walls were in a shocking state, being cracked and crumbling under the flaking brown paint. A draft of air coming from below bore with it the unmistakable odor of mold. Here on the stairs, a sound of movement came from above, and I could hardly bring myself to make the climb. The echoes filtered through a door directly at the head of the stairs, and now that the sound was clearer, I detected what I thought were more voices. These were not like the low mutterings that I had heard previously. They were much clearer and made no attempt at concealment. They possessed a breathless and hollow quality, as if the unintelligible words they uttered were formed by some imperfect replica of the human model, speaking in accents that betrayed their attempt at imitation. I thought of lips not designed for speech, croaking out anguished words, trying vainly to communicate. I stood there in the stairwell for what seemed like minutes, whether it was the awful atmosphere that worked on my brain or whether the sound was real, I couldn't tell. But when I did hear footsteps climbing up from below, they sounded too awkward to be the next timed visitor to the installation. Someone seemed to be staggering, almost dragging his limbs along, and as I looked down, a shadow moved across the wall at a turn in the stairs. It may have been the dim light, but the figure appeared twisted over to one side. I panicked. I raced up towards the door ahead, bolting through it, with no other thought than to get away. I could not stop myself from thinking about the standing mannequin I had seen in the office of the Mad Grins, of that unliving face imbued with an insane animation. Now that I was through the door and it closed behind me, the sound of the broken voices ceased. I stood shaking and listening for a movement, but there was none. Although all was now quiet, the smell of the mold was overpowering. Mold grew everywhere in this corridor. There were great patches on bare walls, and even underfoot on the rotten, threadbare carpet. An arrow scrawled in chalk told me to bear left, and I found myself in another abandoned office. On a desk there were several duplicated sheets of paper filled with handwritten words. The strip lighting here was as poor as elsewhere in the building, and this, coupled with the awkward script, made the words difficult to decipher. Slowly I worked my way through it. The manuscript seemed to be some sort of manifesto, a statement of intent written by Golmi. Mannequins and Aspects of Terror, an art installation by Eliezer Golmi. Many have ruminated on the attraction of horror in art and in literature, but all have drawn erroneous conclusions. The art of false horror seeks not to engender actual fear, but to distance those experiencing it and allow them a pleasurable frisson, the sense that one might approach without arrival. But this installation is a full immersion into terror. It is designed to generate a situation where the individual is subject to that terror and participates directly in it. In this installation, one does not play a character, as does an actor in a play. One is that character. Nor must the artist be exempt from this immersion. In order for the work of art to be authentic, the artist himself must also become a component of it. He must feel the terror that he creates. Remember that there is always an end to suffering in life. Pain, disease, and madness lead either to recovery or to extinction. But such is not necessarily the case in art. In art, a moment may be fixed for all eternity. Imagine, if you will, a simulacrum whose existence is such a state. This is the purpose of my installation. The desolate spaces are my own little universe of terror, and the mannequins are my pretty creations, playing in the wilderness of torment, in the misery of one moment of supreme terror. And I, too, play with them, having deciphered the alphabet of the 221 gates. The greatest fear of which I can conceive is not that of murder or torture, or any of the so-called horrors that man inflicts upon his fellow man. The greatest fear is the prolongation of life indefinitely, where all thoughts are endlessly revisited, where every memory loses its meaning by repetition, where all thoughts finally blend into one. Consciousness doomed to immortality, a mind filled with the nightmare of its own being, a mind that is dying in perpetuity without final release. Our flesh and blood dies, and with it, so too dies the mind. But imagine a mind in a body that cannot die, a body of plastic and paint, carefully crafted in an aspect of pain, terror, disease, madness, and decay. And then imagine what it might be like to be a mind imprisoned forever within that artificial body. What distinction is there between mind and matter? Imprisoned within a mannequin in an aspect of terror, the two become one. The mind, now riddled with the continuous agony of its new body, built expressly for suffering, believes it to be the only existence it has ever known. Plastic and paint seem more real than flesh and blood. Who then is to say which of them is artificial? And should these new bodies start into motion, should those glass eyes turn in their sockets, whom then would deny their occupants the right to welcome visitors to this little universe of terror I have wrought, to welcome them in the only way they know how, so that the same visitors might also participate in their haunted cavalcade throughout all eternity? Let me conclude by thanking you for choosing to experience my installation, for choosing to contribute to my pretty little vision, where henceforth you will see only through my eyes. Yahweh Elohim Met. As I finished reading, I began to feel that I was becoming enmeshed in another man's nightmare. Did I possess an independent existence, or, like the mannequins I had encountered, was I a construction of Eliezer Golmi? The idea was ridiculous, of course. I had not been dreamed into existence. It was just that in this little universe of terror, as he termed it, my life outside the building seemed far away and unreal. I left the room and made my way once more along the moldy corridor. The doors that I passed seemed to be locked, but through their glass panels, I could see the silhouettes of more mannequins. Some appeared to have their faces turned to the walls and were set in crouching positions, whilst others were curled up in a ball on the concrete floors, surrounded by debris. There was one mannequin, however, who had been positioned in front of one of the glass panels. It was more horrifying than any I had seen thus far. It was clad in the same shoddy suit as the others, but its expression was very different. The thing's eyes bulged, and its mouth opened in a grimace of agony that reached across the whole width of its plastic face. Its body was twisted over to one side in a contortion of agony. Awareness, frozen in time, that it had been shaped to suffer. And mingled with that awareness was an abyss of agony. This one could not look at me, for it had its eyes rolled up in their sockets, its head thrown back as far as it could go. I turned away in disgust. Another chalked arrow led me into a further corridor. This one, to my great relief, had a sign marked Exit. I would have run towards the set of double rusted doors at the end of the corridor if I hadn't felt a sudden stiffness in my limbs. It resembled the onset of cramp, and my movements were becoming awkward. I felt like a puppet on strings. By the time I reached the end of the corridor, the pain in my limbs was becoming unbearable. I pushed open the double doors. Beyond was a large room that must once have served as a canteen. The dining tables and chairs remained, although some were broken and others tipped over. Piles of rubbish, mostly paper and empty cartons, were strewn all around, and the tiled walls were smeared with grease. Scattered among the debris were dozens and dozens of mannequins. These dummies were not just tatty, but broken, with smashed limbs and fractured faces, but the agony of my own limbs was so fierce that I could hardly register the scene before me. Through my pain, it seemed that the mannequin closest to me looked like a road accident victim, with broken arms and legs at odd angles, and the top of its head smashed in. Only the eyes were whole, the glass eyes, and peering into them, I gained the impression that there was a mind imprisoned in this damaged form. It was experiencing an agony that no living thing could bear, that flesh and blood could not possibly tolerate. I could not begin to describe their state. To die and decay, and yet not to be released, to be suspended in such a condition forever. I moved on, screaming soundlessly in my mind as my stiff limbs were willed into motion. All around me were dummies in their corpse shells. In the far corner of the canteen was a large mannequin, set apart from the rest. As I drew closer, its features, though as distorted as the others, became recognizable to me. It was a man with a heavy face, and one of his eyes seemed larger than the other, giving him a lopsided appearance. The mouth began to move, emitting a low, grinding noise. As I stood before him, my living flesh and blood became decayed paint and plastic. I waited for him to explain what was happening, but he did not move or speak.